It is so lovely to see you. My name is Jessica Blythe. For those who I haven't gotten the opportunity to cross paths with at these virtual meetings yet, I'm based at Brock University in Central Canada, and I am the lead of the Knowledge Mobilization Working Group. So it is such a pleasure to welcome you to this special session and what is sort of the launch event for the Knowledge Mobilization Working Group. I'm so pleased that you're here. Today, I'm sitting on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and acknowledging reminds us that the great standard of living that we experience is directly related to the resources and the friendship of the Indigenous peoples in this area. So before we jump into the main event, I just wanted to do one piece of housekeeping, which I think is exciting, and I'm using this opportunity and the excitement that will build around it to say the Knowledge Mobilization Working Group is looking for some core members. So after Jayne's inspiring session, if you're interested in joining me, I'd be thrilled to have you. So afterwards, please reach out by email. And if it's something you're interested in, or even just interested in talking about, I'd love to hear from you. So thank you. Okay, so it is my distinct pleasure to welcome our speaker for the event this morning, Jayne Morrish. Jayne is a knowledge mobilization specialist who works to ensure that knowledge is both co-created and co-disseminated. Jayne holds a bachelor degree in psychology from York University. She also holds a master's from Brock University. Jayne is also the recipient of many awards, including the Certificate of Academic Excellence from the Canadian Psychological Association, a 40 Under 40 Awards from Business Links Niagara, and the President's Distinguished Staff Service Award for Outstanding Contributions. Currently, Jayne, as some of you heard maybe already, works as a Knowledge Mobilization Officer at Brock University. And specifically, she focuses on translating and co-creating new knowledge while building really strong and authentic connections with communities and partners. So her work is so important to us as the V2V partnership. I've had the privilege of attending some of Jayne's workshops in the past, and everything I know about knowledge mobilization comes from her. She's incredibly knowledgeable, incredibly kind and generous. I could not be more pleased to turn the floor over and to offer a warm welcome to Jayne.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm just going to share my screen here. Should be good to go. Let me know if you're seeing it. I saw some reflections change. Perfect. Awesome. Okay. So let's get started. One thing I was going to start with, which was a land acknowledgement, but I just, Jessica's already done that. So I just want to say a big miigwech to my ancestors and everyone here on Turtle Island for hosting us on the ancestral lands. Outline for today. What are you in for the next 2 hours? What have you signed up for here? So we're going to have this first presentation, which is just going to be an intro presentation. Like, let's just get the foundation set. And then we'll have some time for discussion. If someone needs to go to the washroom, you can use that quick time. We'll then jump into knowledge mobilization strategies. Okay, how do you actually do this? Another quick break for chat. And then I'm going to do a quick, like, rapid fire 25-minute session on let's talk about just some key considerations. Plain language communication. How do you evaluate this work? What about grant writing? That small thing that academics have to worry about. And then a 15-minute final discussion. Anyone that wasn't here at the beginning, this is being recorded. I will send all of my slides because what I'm doing is just like, it's a high level intro. And then here's a lot of resources. And as I noted as well, I can now be a resource to any of you. Please feel free to email me. I am happy to chat one-on-one. If Jessica is involved in a project, I'm happy to provide in-kind support to projects, can come back to the working group and talk through things at any point. Interrupt me for questions though as well. I also, one note for all this is I will be talking a little bit from the Canadian context, because that's the context in which I exist in this world. And a lot of this has flown down from like the Canadian funders as well. So that's kind of what you're in for. Jessica mentioned a little bit about who I am. So yes, I am the Knowledge Mobilization Officer at Brock. I work within our Office of Research Services. I'm technically kind of sort of seconded to our research institute, which is the Lifespan Development Research Institute, which studies how people grow and change, which is cool. Beyond my education, I do have a lot of applied experience in KT. So I used to coordinate KT at a national nonprofit. I am a credentialed evaluator. I hold the Knowledge Translation Professional Certificate from the University of Toronto, the Mobilize YU Certificate from New York University. And then I've gone through St. Mike's Hospital, their end of grant KT training. So I do have some, that's where all of this has kind of come in. Jumping right in. What is knowledge mobilization? What is this thing? First, what I want to do is review the different terms that get mentioned a lot. And there are quite a few that I'm going to go through. And you're going to be hearing these terms like, that's the same thing. It's just a different, like knowledge mobilization, knowledge translation. I promise you, I will land you on one final, like tangible piece once I get through these terms. So first, there is knowledge mobilization. Basically, that just refers to the movement of created knowledge into active use. And really, it just comes down to ensuring that the right information is available to the right people at the right time, and most importantly, in the right format, so as to influence their decision-making. SSHRC, which is a funding agency here in Canada, their definition of knowledge mobilization is that it refers to the, quote, reciprocal and complementary flow and uptake of research knowledge between researchers, knowledge brokers, and knowledge users, both within and beyond academia, in such a way that may benefit users and create positive impacts within Canada and or internationally, and ultimately has the potential to enhance the profile, reach, and impact of social sciences and humanities research. So with knowledge mobilization, what you're doing is you're just moving knowledge that exists from research into action with people that can use it. And ideally, this will result in evidence-based decision-making and allowing for what we often call evidence-informed practice or behaviors. Now, more than just bridging a gap, like here's the knowledge I have, here's what you need, and let's make them meet. Knowledge mobilization, it seeks to make connections between research and expertise and policy and practice, or more importantly, just people, the people of the world, in order to improve outcomes in various organizations or sectors or groups. Now, knowledge mobilization, it's very much a proactive process that involves specific efforts to build relationships between knowledge creators, which is a term I'm going to describe in a second, and knowledge users. Now, knowledge mobilization is the term I subscribe to. It's what I like. So I'm going to be referring to as knowledge mobilization throughout the presentation. As you will hear in a second, there are different terms, and that might be what you're familiar with. The next big one is knowledge translation, or KT. And that can very much be considered an umbrella term for the process of moving research evidence into practice. This very much comes down from another Canadian funding organization, the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, or what we call CIHR. I'm not going to read their very boring bureaucratic definition. It's up on the screen. But at CHR, they basically see the term KT as a very broad concept, and that it just encompasses all the steps between the creation of new knowledge through research and inquiry, and its application to yield beneficial outcomes for society. Now, although this CHR definition mentions only the healthcare system, KT can be applied to a variety of disciplines. And moving beyond that very technical definition, knowledge translation, it's just about taking created knowledge like research and working with various individuals to translate, exchange, and apply it in a form that allows for benefits to the individuals who can use that information. And again, this could be for anyone. It could be the public, for policymakers, practitioners, or even just for other researchers. Other researchers use knowledge, they use research to further what they do. Now, before we go any further, because this is always during when I've done my presentations, I get a question about this. Someone raises their hand and says, hold on, what if my research can't go out to the public? So with those basic definitions in mind, and then understanding that this KT, KMB field, it's about research impact. One piece I'd like to note is that not every single piece of research needs to have some kind of broad impact. That doesn't make sense. That's actually not equitable or ethical. This is a great quote from Lavis and colleagues, who's a big person in this field, that says, not all research can or should have impact. Some bodies of research knowledge will not generate a take-home message because either the research has no application for decision makers or their findings were not conclusive. That said, this excuse can be overused. I feel like sometimes researchers can worry about the fact that their single research project or their big research project may not have some kind of broad take-home message for society. I often hear researchers say, no, my research just isn't marketable, Jayne. That's okay. It would actually be really inequitable to try to make all research or knowledge the focus of some kind of broad knowledge mobilization strategy. We don't need to hear about everything on every study on CNN. That doesn't need to be what happens. So if you feel like your own work at some point does not lead to kind of broad knowledge mobilization for the community at any point, that's okay. One caveat though, the but, which should be flashing at the bottom of the screen, is that all research should be mobilized with other researchers. So that maybe you are informing another researcher and maybe their work will be more, well, marketable, as people like to say. Maybe their work will be able to talk to the public later on. You're still part of that chain of knowledge mobilization. Just because you can't put it out to the public doesn't mean that you're not mobilizing. Publications and conferences are still a form of knowledge mobilization. Back to the terms. We have knowledge creators. And that's just this fun term that refers to individuals who actually create new knowledge. So all of you as researchers, you're a knowledge creator. There's your new fun term to refer to yourself at a party. Well, I work as a knowledge creator. That's your new jazzy term. We also have knowledge users, and that refers to people who can use created knowledge. CIHR, that lovely funding agency in Canada, they define knowledge users as an individual who is likely to be able to use research results to make informed decisions about policies, programs, and/or practices and behaviors, I like to add in. Under this heading of knowledge user, it can be other researchers. When you're reading a journal article, you're also a knowledge user at that point. It could be partner organizations, media, community-based organizations, practitioners, and the general public. A lot of the times this group is referred to as your audience. Who is the audience of this knowledge? There are some other terms emerging. So you may have heard some of these, one being the term next user. So who is the next user of this knowledge after you? Recognizing that you don't just pass knowledge along and it stops with them. But basically these two terms describe the people that actually make knowledge and the people that this knowledge applies to. And as I mentioned, these groups are not mutually exclusive. One thing that's also emerging here is that the term user can be a bit problematic. It infers that these groups and individuals are simply passive receptors of information. Oh, this person's a user of my knowledge. So there are two terms that are emerging. I'm actually liking them a little bit. I'm trying to push them a little bit more. And it's the idea of context experts and content experts. So context experts refer to the people directly affected by the topics being investigated, community members, patients, general public, etc. They're the contextual experts of what you are studying and researching. And then we have subject matter and content experts, and that refers to people with specific knowledge of the topic, such as researchers. And knowledge mobilization is basically the collaboration between these groups to share their knowledge and push that knowledge forward. If you want to learn more about these, there's a wonderful article called The Context Experts. I've got it up on the screen. And as I mentioned, everyone's getting these slides. I'm seeing some stuff in the chat. Jessica, is there anything that's coming up that's a question that we want to talk about quickly?
No, thank you. I'll monitor for questions. People are just chiming in with comments related to topic. But yeah, I'll interrupt if there's questions.
Awesome. If there's a question, perfect. Thank you. Okay. So as you can see, there's a lot of different terms in this field. And depending on who you're talking to, you may be told that the key overarching title for this field is different. For example, some people love knowledge translation. That's what CIHR uses. It's actually in the CIHR mandate, the term knowledge translation, which means it would take an act of parliament for CIHR to stop calling it knowledge translation. And this is the term that's most commonly used in healthcare. So if you're in healthcare, they are calling it KT. Some people really subscribe to the term knowledge mobilization. They like that mobilization part of the term and how it implies kind of a movement of knowledge into action to have impact. In Canada, SSHRC uses this term within their granting processes. It's most common in the social sciences and humanities fields. There's research utilization, which has been a term that's been used since I would say about the 1970s to describe the incorporation of research evidence into clinical practice. That's a term that you're going to hear a lot in the nursing profession. There's also the term knowledge management that gets used. A few years ago, we saw the emergence of a term K-star, just to try to amalgamate all of the terms into one. It did not take off, thank goodness, because I didn't want to be a K-star officer. Another term that sometimes gets thrown in is implementation science, which is, quote, the scientific study of methods to promote evidence, systematic uptake of research findings into evidence-based practices, into routine practice, and hence to improve the quality and effectiveness of health services and care. So basically, implementation science is knowledge translation to inform healthcare practices. And there is considerable overlap between the terms. I'm sure you're hearing them like they all sound like the same. That's true. But the basic definitions can affect our understanding of the topic. For example, earlier definitions of the term knowledge translation, it very much implied that knowledge was like an object that could be given from one person to another, and that this was a unidirectional process, which is why some people really like the term knowledge mobilization, as that definition is always kind of mentioned a bidirectional relationship between the knowledge creators and the knowledge users. However, even at CIHR, that large funding body, they're now placing a fair bit of emphasis on the that exchange aspect of their definition that involves a dialogue. An important implication of this change is that even though CIHR, they definitely encourages researchers to translate the results of their studies, they also understand that this needs to be done in a thoughtful, ethical, and equitable manner, with the audience of said KT being considered and engaged within the process of knowledge translation as much as possible and where relevant. In fact, as this term knowledge translation evolves, it's more commonly referred to as knowledge translation and exchange now. The key piece being that introduction of the word exchange, which implies a dialogue between the knowledge creators and the knowledge users to make sure that everything makes sense together. You might have a lot of research, but you need to talk with your knowledge users about what research they want to know and how the heck they want to know it. All of this aside, no matter the term that you choose, this field, it is very simple. It is about the movement of research knowledge into applicable uses with relevant groups. As stated by Strauss and colleagues, who Strauss is a very big leader in this field, the common element among these different terms is a move beyond simple dissemination of knowledge into actual use of knowledge. KT, KMB, K, whatever you want to call it, it's not just about sharing or publishing or one-way information flow. It's about engagement, audience participation, people coming together, and attention to impact and evidence. And evidence doesn't just mean research. It can include evidence from your audience. What works for them? What do they want to know? And this piece is really important. Knowledge mobilization, knowledge translation, it's not just about pushing research out. It's also about engaging with people to create relevant information and disseminate it in impactful ways. A big learning here is that, yes, research has a lot to give to people, to audiences. But people also have a lot that they can give to help to inform research. They often bring the context of how research matters in the real world and how people want to know about it. And basically, regardless of the term, the underlying intent in all cases is to make research matter more for policy, practice, and for people, and to make sure that people have a place within this knowledge mobilization process. On the next slide, I'm going to show you like the one thing that you need to take away, but one thing I always like to note on here, that little asterisk thing at the bottom. You might be a knowledge mobilizer, and that might be the term you love. Please just always use the term that your funder uses within a granting application. So if you're applying for a CIHR, you love KT at that point. You're a knowledge translator, even though in your heart, you might be a knowledge mobilizer.
Jayne, just before you jump to the next slide, I was going to share just a few comments coming in from the chat, and I think they're reflective of this group's sort of ethos around knowledge co-production. And so, for example, Cornelia shared that also practitioners can be knowledge producers and holders, obviously, not just the recipients of knowledge. And Prateep said, which I think is really important, that maybe knowledge co-creators and co-users are sort of terms that are applicable for us, because in many of the places where we work, the small scale fishers are also the content experts, because they've got generations of ecological knowledge, social knowledge, cultural knowledge about the fishery. So yeah, just some reflections coming in from the chat that are very much on board with this idea of exchange and co-production. Yeah. Thanks.
Wonderful. And that's why I really like that content and context experts piece, because I found the knowledge creator piece very much, the definition just implies that it's researchers, which is why I'm trying to lean into that content and context experts, because anyone could be you could bring content, right? You could be both at the same time, right?
Absolutely.
So that's wonderful.
Yep. Thank you.
No problem. So boiling all of this down, these specific terms that you use to describe this field, they're not important per se. What is important is how these terms are operationalized. That process is actually pretty simple. The goal of KT-KMB is to ensure that there's a collaborative, equitable, and respectful feedback loop between knowledge and research. So knowledge, again, being, as you said, the small scale fishers they have knowledge, right? That may not be research, but they have content. They have that. and the people or groups that can use this information. And again, people could be anyone. It could be other researchers. It could be the general public. Anyone can fit within these terms depending on where you're at within the process. The big piece to note here is that KT-KMB exists to ensure that there's the movement of knowledge and research flows in this circular fashion so as to inform people, in quotes, be that through practice, collaboration, dissemination, policy, or even just general awareness of research findings and kind of content that is relevant. And then further informing research as appropriate and relevant by learning from these people, what they might want to know, how they might want to know it, how they might be able to use this research, and what knowledge they might have to contribute to the entire process and research itself. So that is kind of knowledge mobilization on the footing. But then we move into the why. Some of you this may be very much like, you're like, I get this, I know the why, but I always like to show it just because it always gets asked. Every single cocktail party I go to, they're like, why do you have a job? And then I have to explain my existence. So this field mainly exists because there's something called the knowledge to action gap, where the research is not always having the impact that it should. This is due largely in part to two main issues. First is a failure on the part of what we call those knowledge creators to appropriately share. And second is a failure on the part of knowledge users to appropriately act on creative knowledge. So basically that feedback loop I showed you, there's a problem there. People aren't always talking to research and knowledge holders aren't always talking to people. We're not always listening to each other. This is definitely not a new issue. I know for some of you it's very early, it's very late, but I am going to show a video to demonstrate this knowledge to action gap in action long before any of us were even born.
Do you have time for a quick story? I thought you might. A long time ago, an unknown illness impacting men at sea led to the failure of many expeditions. In 1497, a voyage led by Vasco da Gama experienced one of the earliest outbreaks. After 6 months at sea, most of his crew had fallen ill. In 1601, Captain James Lancaster set sail with a fleet of 4 ships. One ship was given lemon juice while the others weren't. The ship given lemon juice suffered fewer losses. Nearly 150 years later, British Navy physician James Lind developed an experiment to test possible cures. 12 men displaying typical symptoms of scurvy were divided into pairs. Within a few days, the pairs given oranges and lemons got better. In 1795, the British Navy took action, and the provision of lemon juice became routine. 70 years later, the shipping industry joined in, and citrus became mandatory. So, from the time citrus was suspected to be a remedy for scurvy to the time it became a part of policy for sailors, nearly 4 centuries had passed. The moral of the story? Failing to share and act on evidence can be a major problem. Today, there is more healthcare evidence than ever, but figuring out how to apply it poses a big challenge to those who work in healthcare.
So, after watching that video, you can likely see there's probably always been an issue around the appropriate sharing and use of knowledge. This gap still clearly exists on some level in contemporary society. In fact, research has shown that it might take roughly 17 years for only 14% of research to find its way into practice. This phenomenon has been colloquially referred to as the 17-year odyssey of research. But please also note there are numerous reasons behind the length of time between research and practice, which go beyond obviously the scope of this presentation today. The green article that I have cited at the end of the slides is a good place to look if this is something you're interested in. Another very important piece to note is that these filters at the bottom of this graphic are really important. Most research cannot and should not translate directly from basic research into practice. I mean, could we imagine someone doing a basic research study on a new healthcare practice and being like, now we do this. I found that wearing orange shirts on Wednesdays reduces cancer. Like you can't do that. However, what is important here is that knowledge does need help traveling through this pathway at a more effective speed. Shortening the gap between research and practice, what it requires is an increased understanding of what it takes to implement new research and a broader understanding of how to effectively and equitably mobilize. Focusing just on the healthcare system, the reason being that is that because most of the stats around the why come from the healthcare system because it's a bit easier to measure. In fact, as stated by Grimshaw and colleagues, they say one of the most consistent findings from clinical and health services research is the failure to translate research into practice and policy. So we look to that area just for examples of this issue around knowledge translation. It's been found that 30 to 40% of patients may not be receiving care that adheres to scientific evidence. 20 to 25% of provided care may not be needed or may actually be harmful. Research has shown that there could be an estimated 30% improvement in cancer outcomes with optimum application of what is currently being known. We could see a 10% reduction in cancer mortality through effective use of state-of-the-art therapies. It's also been found that 26 to 95% of patients across the globe are dissatisfied with the information they receive from their physicians. Another example, which is very, very true to me as a new mom, is that antibiotics are still overprescribed to children with upper respiratory tract infection symptoms, even though science doesn't support it. However, another big however in this is that there are huge problems with the premature adoptions of treatment and research before they've been shown to be beneficial or accurate, just as I mentioned on that last slide. Just because one study showed some kind of association or some way that we could maybe change the way the world works doesn't mean that we start doing that the next day. Pushing research out too quickly and not in a careful or could be not in a careful way, it could be ineffective, harmful, and it's unethical to do that. It's very important to remember that no single study or research finding should lead to policy or practice changes. Remember the filters that I just showed on the graph from the last slide. Practice and policy change should require bodies of supporting research and collaboration between those content and context experts along a longer period of time. We just have to hope it's not 17 years. So the issue here is a very, very complex one. Research findings need to be translated in order to close this gap, but this needs to be done carefully and thoughtfully and with science and safety at the forefront, and recognizing you can't overstate the science. I cannot tell you how many times I have grad students coming to me saying, you know what, I found this cool association in my master's thesis, and I want to do a policy paper on it. We should change policy. And I have to be like, hold on, it's one study. Like, is this generalizable to the population? Has it been replicated? All of those pieces. And all of this, I would say, is where the field of knowledge mobilization comes in, focusing on training and dedicating resources to creating a bridge between those knowledge creators and knowledge users, or generally just people, in order to get the most updated, relevant, and accurate information into action with the appropriate groups of people in the appropriate way and at the appropriate time, when there's enough research to warrant it. Beyond just closing the loop and beyond those kind of general issues, there's also the UN Declaration on Human Rights, which actually speaks about knowledge mobilization. Specifically, Article 27 in this declaration states that everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts, and to share in scientific advancements and its benefits. So it's actually a general human right to be able to share in scientific advancements and the benefits of it. Another one, which I'm sure we've all experienced in the last couple of years, is that authentic, accurate, and equitable knowledge mobilization can also help to combat misinformation. I would say this is the thing that I get asked about the most now. Why does misinformation exist? Which I'm going to chat about a little bit when I get into plain language. But this is a wonderful article right here. It's a recent one. It talks about science communication, which is basically knowledge mobilization in the age of misinformation. And this article states that insufficient, inadequate, or poorly executed science communication efforts hinder science dissemination, implementation, and sustainability. For example, science and misinformation can directly impact population health, sometimes with devastating consequences, as evidenced during public health crises, such as the ongoing pandemic. Beyond just closing the gap and that kind of general, it's a good thing to do, the world needs to know about this. There's one other reason to do knowledge mobilization that I would say is on people's minds a fair bit of time in research, and that is funding. So the integration of a knowledge mobilization component is becoming a common requirement in most funding applications, be that through the government or external funding applications. I helped someone for the Dairy Farmers of Canada, a grant for the Dairy Farmers of Canada, and they had a 2-page knowledge mobilization section. So it's coming, it's everywhere. And this is even true at the graduate level. I don't know if there's any graduate students on the call today, but I'm sure all of you have graduate students. And reviewers are even paying attention at the graduate level to student applications that have even just like a small section, like a sentence or two that talks about knowledge mobilization. Through the inclusion of knowledge mobilization, funders have really seen that they can help to ensure that their funding dollars have applied benefits, longevity beyond set funding periods, and increased return to society. And to boil it down, funders have seen that requiring individuals to focus on the applied aspect of their work will give them better value for what they see as their investments, their investment in research. This concept was well put by Lavis in 2003 when he stated that lots of time and money are spent on the production of research knowledge. More value for money could be obtained by helping research organizations and their knowledge brokers transfer research knowledge in ways consistent with our evolving understanding about how to best undertake knowledge transfer. As such, in order to compete in the fast-paced world of research and research funding, it is really important to make sure that your own work has a KMB plan and support built in. This will make it much more attractive to potential funders. And from at least what I am seeing, for those big dollars, you need to have knowledge mobilization in there, and the reviewers are paying attention to it. I'm working on a large SHRC partnership grant application right now, and that's where we scored the highest and why we actually got put through to the next round, the knowledge mobilization piece. Some other whys, there's taxpayer accountability. There's also purposefulness. As all of you as researchers, I'm sure you want to get your information out there, and you have a responsibility to do this. I imagine that on some level, each of you got interested in the research that you do for it to have impact for other researchers and for people, right? For the people that this research matters for. If there's any students on the call, another thing I like to remind students is you will likely get a question about KT or KMB at your defense. It was put to me by a CRC, a Canada Research Chair here at Brock, that by the time your committee members get to your defense, they're often questioned out. And this researcher often asks students, if you were removing snow outside your home one day and your neighbor asked you what you researched, what would you say to your neighbor? And being able to answer that question means you have to understand KT. And finally, I would say that community members, organizations, et cetera, are becoming very smart, I would say, consumers of research information and how to engage with research and researchers. So there's a raising of the tides of sorts around being a researcher now. And KT and KMB helps to meet that need and helps to share that knowledge so that it's a collaborative effort. Any questions just before we go into the last section of this piece?
No, there's some great sort of resources and comments being shared, but I think we'll just wait till the open discussion section to open it up.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Great. So what I like to do before I move on to we'll have our discussion section, then we'll talk about strategies, is to talk about partners in the community, because this comes up a lot. And what I like to talk about is just people and knowledge mobilization. And so when we start to think around partnerships and knowledge mobilization, forming those kind of alliances and allegiances with community organizations, things like formal partnerships, like I am working with this community organization, I'm working with this group to do knowledge mobilization, that's very important. But general people work is likely the most important form of partnership and knowledge mobilization. And that forms the foundation for the later formalization of relationships. And just a quick review here, it's a clear theme that your knowledge users or your people should be at the center of all that you do in knowledge mobilization. And as a reminder, who are your people? It's anyone that can use your research or knowledge. It's the people that your work might have relevance or impact on. I know we had a couple people saying like, oh, it could be it's many different things, right? These are just some examples of who your people could be. Just even community members are people. And when it comes to people, it's fairly well accepted that researchers, clinicians, education institutions, they should practice KT or KMB at some level. We know it's, as I just mentioned, it's important for funding, it's important for tenure promotion, it's an important tool, it's how you get your knowledge and research out there. However, what is not always accepted or understood is how and why people should be engaged in this process. I think that all of you will understand what I'm saying on the next slide. I think I'm in a very safe space around this. But sometimes, and I have some horror stories, people, those knowledge users, can be seen as the other when people are doing research or knowledge mobilization. It can be thought that people out of the research team lack something, such as research skills or critical thinking, or they lack research or information, that they need help. We talked about that user phrase being problematic. And sometimes it's seen that, oh, I just need knowledge users and partners to put this grant in. And then those people never hear from the researchers again. It happens I have to heal a lot of relationships that I didn't break when I start to build partnerships. And unfortunately, some of the time, research may not consider the lens of relevant people. And on this note, I just also like to note and underscore how important it is that research should be driven by researchers. You are the experts in the area. You best know how to accurately and effectively conduct research. However, as we move into a larger focus on knowledge mobilization, we should be working to involve people in that process where appropriate is relevant. One thing I've learned is that people should be seen as collaborative and necessary partners. We should recognize that people offer something to this process as well, such as unique expertise, relevant language, evidence. Jessica, you mentioned how the small scale fishers, they have that content of a lot of historical knowledge around what's going on in this area. They offer the context. They can talk about dissemination techniques. I work a lot with youth. I don't know how to tell youth about new knowledge. I don't understand TikTok, but they are the ones that understand how youth access knowledge. And also they can help to create trust among broader knowledge user groups. So if you get in with certain groups of people, they can say, hey, I trust these researchers, let them in. And it's always an important thing to remember that your people should be your partners on your grants, informing your work where relevant, and they should be community representatives. And that research should always consider societal needs where relevant and where applicable from a transdisciplinary perspective. And most importantly, when working with people, it does not always have to involve a formalized agreement. It can or should be whatever type of engagement works best for you and for your people. So as I mentioned, that youth example, I can't form a formal partnership with youth to put on a grant application, right? I can't get all of youth to sign on saying this is great. But what I have done is created the Brock Youth Engagement Committee, which is an engagement committee of youth across Niagara who can inform grant applications and can be put into my knowledge mobilization section to show how I have brought relevant people into the process. Why is this important? Obviously, when you're doing knowledge mobilization, your people are the ones that this research relates to. They should be at the center of a lot of your decisions. And with that in mind, you need to make sure that your knowledge mobilization makes sense for your people. Are you mobilizing in the ways that they typically access information? Jessica, we were talking before this session started being like, what about translation? Is this even in a language that they understand that's accessible to them? I have learned the hard way that if you do not center your knowledge mobilization work and planning around your people, you will have a very hard time having impact and uptake. Why does this matter? If we want our research or knowledge that we're working on to be usable, we need to integrate it into the context of people. And this calls for genuine participation, authentic engagement, and a recognition that knowledge mobilization is not linear. And basically, you can have the prettiest forms of knowledge mobilization. You can have the best infographic that's ever been created. But if you don't have your knowledge users, your people at the table, then your knowledge mobilization is not likely to go very far. If research is to be used, it needs to answer important questions of concern to your knowledge users, and it must be integrated within contextual evidence in order to become actionable in a specific setting. And this can only be accomplished if there's genuine participation of your people from the beginning of the research process. You need to ask yourself some of the questions that I have up on the screen. What information do people even want? What issues are they having? How do they get their information? What information do they want? All of those different pieces. Overall, there's a movement happening broadly throughout research and knowledge mobilization towards being focused on what is called knowledge exchange, which is basically an understanding that researchers and the community people, they need to collaborate. This is a wonderful quote. I actually know it off by heart because I cite it probably once a week in meetings, is that there's an evolution from transfer to engagement in knowledge translation theory and practice. And it's occurring alongside and in response to other challenges to traditional research approaches, and reflects an increasing understanding that knowledge must not only be scientifically valid, but also socially robust. So in your knowledge mobilization work, I challenge you to lean into this evolution and make sure that your own knowledge mobilization plans, they align with research, but they also respect and align with your people, and that your people have a seat at that table. Work towards people engagement, however that works for you. It might be formalized partnerships with organizations, or it might just be a knowledge user engagement group, or a content engagement group where you have people together sharing. So you're all talking and learning together. For myself and for many others, it's becoming very clear that research and knowledge mobilization should focus on bringing content and context experts together, and that context experts bring a wealth of knowledge to the process. Specifically, they can answer questions like, why is this important to them? What is important to them? How do they want to learn about it? And in general, that we should be conceptualizing all of this as research and knowledge mobilization done with people, not on or for people. One question that I also get, and I'm going to quickly skim over this, and that's a bunch of resources. Okay, what about community engagement? Yes, community engagement is another big aspect of this. engaging community members in the research process is often the missing link to improving the quality of outcomes of health promotion activities, disease prevention initiatives, and research studies. There is an entire large body on community engaged research. There are many different ways to do it. That goes beyond the scope of today, but what I have done is on the next slides is curated the kind of best resources if you want to start learning about community engagement within research and within knowledge mobilization. I have also just crafted a micro credential on this, but I'm happy to share once it goes live. So those are those resources there. And as I mentioned, you're going to get these slides. One complex issue before we wrap up this section, so this is my last slide on this one, is that I want to mention is ethics as well. So ensuring that when you do engage, you do so with ethics at the forefront. So when you're engaging with people, you've got to remember there are ethics there as well. This entire slide is based off of the work of Neufeld and colleagues. They outlined a process for developing guidelines around conducting ethical research in heavily researched communities, particularly those that are marginalized. The background for this work is that within marginalized communities, research within marginalized communities often benefits the researcher disproportionately and leaves such communities feeling exploited, misrepresented, and often exhausted. So as part of this work, this team led by Neufeld created a research manifesto. And it was actually work that they did in the downtown East Side in Vancouver, BC, Canada. Where a lot of research has been done with specific marginalized populations, and the community was just done. So there is a Research 101 resource. I've got both of those up online. I've got the current links for it. They update it continually. So if you want to look more into that and their recommendations, that is all up there. And I will stop sharing now because up next we'll do our discussion, any questions, and then we'll go into KT-KMB strategies.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jayne, for the intro to knowledge mobilization. I'm glad that's the term you use because that's what our working group is called. And I think a lot of this sort of co-creation and community-based research really speaks to this group. Many people in the room are my heroes on, pushing that work forward. Prateep, for example, has been working with communities in India, where he is in the Chilaka Lagoon for decades, and really sort of has championed that work. But let's open it up to questions or comments about that sort of first introduction to knowledge mobilization and why or how it's relevant for us as a V2V partnership. Yeah, I see. Faluk, why don't you go right ahead? You're still muted.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the brilliant presentation and the different angles from which you came from. And because I was trying to relate the health angles to fisheries all the time you were making your presentation. And this morning I had a discussion that I want to bring up about researchers going to communities to collect information. And somebody was telling me that there was a meeting with community leaders in the state where I am now, and they are now demanding some amount of money that I think is outrageous. So I want to know, what are your thoughts about researchers engaging with community, and must it be monetized? Must it be rewarded, or must it be paid for? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. One of the ones that keeps me up at night. So I will preface all of this that when you are doing any kind of community engagement, the best way to start is you need to set the parameters and expectations and compensation and engagement beforehand. Before you have the go in, you need to set, like, this is what it is. This is where we can offer you this. Like, what is it that you get out of this? And if it's just that they're going to be engaged in the process and will get access to the knowledge, then that needs to be outlined. I will say, though, that the best practice for engaging with any kind of people or communities is to provide some form of respectful and authentic compensation. So one example is I run, in order to create the space for our researchers here at Brock to talk to the community, a bunch of community engagement groups. I pay all of them. So we actually use institutional dollars to pay. They all get honorariums. And they're not huge for our youth engagement committee. They meet once a month and they only get $150 a year. right? So that's not a lot of money, but it's still something to say thank you when you were noting it's an outrageous amount of money, right? And that's why all of that needs to be said ahead of time, and why when you're doing a grant, you need to budget for this. So you can ask for funding dollars to do this, but so I think my answer is that yes, I think there is a form of compensation that needs to be given, and it should not be tokenistic. Like I've seen some groups literally give others a token, like here's a mug, thanks for all of your knowledge. So it should be something that is respectful and valued. Another example is I work a lot with Indigenous communities. I myself am Métis, and sometimes it's just a pouch of tobacco because that means something to that community, right? But all of those terms should be set out ahead of time. This is what you are getting for this, and that conversation should happen before the engagement happens. Oh, you're still muted. The lovely world of online.
The other thing I want to bring out, which you mentioned in your discussion, was the issue of not going back to the community and you having to now settle what you are not involved in from the beginning. Some research work do not necessarily take you back to the community after it is over.
Mm-hmm.
And so that creates that gap that you now came into to sort out things eventually. And I don't also believe that we should give empty promises when we are not going to come back.
Yep.
So from what I just heard from your last contribution is that right from the beginning, one should let them know if you are coming back, if you are not coming back. If it's just a research to get information and knowledge that can be used in future, or if it's one that you are coming back, because I'm speaking from the point of a researcher who is sponsoring himself or herself and needs the information, because information from these small scale fisheries can only be obtained from the operators, most of the information aside from what you read from books. But if you really want to get to the root of the things that you need and get authentic information, you need to speak with them. And if they're still expecting you to come back and do something for the community, whereas it is not within your research budget and scope, that is a problem. Thank you.
Yes, and that's why I think it's, again, you set that out from the beginning. Like, because I have to remind a lot of our partners that I work with a lot of the times, we're not creating programs in the community. Like we work with a lot of community organizations. I've mentioned I work a lot with youth, and we work with these groups and they're like, okay, well, what program are you going to create for me? We're not. We're going to do research that might help other organizations create programs, but that's not us. Now, one thing I'd like to say around that thing, like we won't be going back to the community. Start to maybe think around ways that you could go back, but it doesn't mean you're doing something for them. It could be, you know what, as we do some publications, we'll send you some of the summaries that are in an accessible format, so they still get access to the knowledge they help to create. But it doesn't mean you're going back and doing something for them. And you set those parameters ahead of time. Again, I work a lot with Indigenous communities. We may not be going back into a fly-in community here in Canada and making a program for youth, but we can share our knowledge in accessible format so that they also own it and have a way to use it. I hope that helps. When I work with communities, it is extra work, but I take the time to go back and say, hey, this is what we found. We're not making a program with it. We're not doing something for you, but this is what we found. And I take it, it is extra time, and it means I do a lot of presentations and community engagement work. But I find that they find that respectful as well, because they're still integrated. They're still involved.
Thank you, Jayne. I'm keeping my eye on the time as well. So I think we'll do one more question if that's all right with you, and then maybe we can move to the next. So Cornelia, I see your hand raised. Let's go over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I think it's not so much the question of what you do for them in the sense of, okay, we come back and solve your problems. I think it's much more that you feedback a broader based analysis to which many people have contributed, and then arrange a format where they can discuss what the outcomes were and what it means to them, and start addressing the questions that arose through the investigation, or whether it's questionnaires or some other form of interaction to generate new insights. And actually empower or support that they themselves take action, because this is what engagement is really about. It's not somebody from Ottawa or, you know, from some remote place at a university goes in to solve their problems. Now, and it is all about putting them into a better condition that they solve their problem through collective action, and to draw in insights that go beyond the university, the community. There is a lot of evidence that shows that people who have multiple connections, trusted connections, including outside their inner circle, have a much greater chance to succeed in mastering unexpected shocks, or seeing an opportunity and seizing it, etc. So I believe very much into emphasizing with them rather than for them. Thank you.
Yes, I think you hit it. That is everything right there on the note. That is exactly what it should be. And it doesn't have to be, we're going back and doing that. But there is sometimes a savior complex that comes up, like, oh, we will come back and here we are with our knowledge. It needs to be, this is what we have all learned together. And it's also empowering people, like, this is knowledge, you can also use this, you own this as well. And let's talk about together what this means. Because I, as a researcher, can tell you what I think it means, but your knowledge is equally, it is the collaborative piece is the big piece. And so even thinking of, like, let's have a community discussion at the end. Let's have a forum where we talk about what this means and how we can all collectively move this forward. And maybe the researchers have no part in moving it forward. Maybe it's just the community or the partners or the people, but it's all, everyone having a seat at the table.
Yeah, thank you both. I love that. I see that we've whipped through almost the first hour, so I'm going to throw the floor back to you, Jayne. But just before we go, I wanted to mention a comment from Prateep in the chat, which I think is really important for us as the V2V partnership, is that point about compensation is so important for us, because we want to engage with our community partners and our fishing communities and operators in ways that are respectful and appropriate and recognize their massive expertise. However, with the caveat that it's highly contextual. And so I think it's just something for us to flag as the V2V partnership is obviously, and you know, we've got people here who have worked with coastal communities for decades, but that it needs to be a highly contextualized conversation. But I think, Jayne, your point about establishing the expectations and being very clear about them up front is one of the best practices in terms of respectful and appropriate and contextualized engagement.
Awesome.
Okay. Back to you. Thank you.
I will whip through some of this, not because it's not important, but because some of it's like, how many infographics can you look at? Switching gears a bit, the next big question that comes up, okay, is like, how do we do this? How do I mobilize? The how and the doing part of KT and KMB, it's typically done through what are called knowledge mobilization strategies. Again, this is a very high level overview of what knowledge mobilization strategies are. What I have done is just given a lot of resources around creating it. But with all of this, I want to start with a reminder about engagement. It just works very well with what we just talked about, the fact that this should be a collaborative pieces. The most important thing that you need to keep in mind when you are doing knowledge mobilization is that your strategy should be based off of what is relevant for your knowledge users, for your people, and how they actually access information. And how can you collaboratively involve them in, you don't have to do all this on your own, right? Maybe it's giving knowledge back to the community and letting them create knowledge mobilization strategies. You don't have to do it all. But when you are selecting knowledge mobilization strategies, you have to ask yourself, are you selecting ones that are relevant to the ways that your audience, your people can actually access information? If you're putting stuff online, but they don't have access to the internet, how is that an equitable knowledge mobilization strategy? Are you talking about information that's actually relevant to them? What about the information and knowledge that they have to contribute to the process? How can you collaboratively do this together? Or how can they just do it on their own and you provide the knowledge so it's a collaborative piece together? You don't always have to be there doing that with them. You should never select a knowledge mobilization strategy because it's easier, it's everyone else is doing. Everyone in my world wants to make a podcast and an infographic right now. And I have to have conversations once a week being like, do you have to? Is it just because they're cool? Do your people actually want information that way? Do people really want another podcast? With knowledge mobilization strategies, it's important to note that the process of mobilizing and translating is universal. The content and context will vary. Why is this important? Why do you need to think about your knowledge users, your people? Well, as researchers, we might think that the way that we're presenting our information, it's great. Look at this great infographic. But what about what your knowledge users, what about your people are seeing? Have you selected knowledge mobilization strategies that are relevant to the way that they actually want to and can access information? Are you talking about information that's relevant to them? Have you included them in the process? Where's their voice within this knowledge mobilization strategy? And that brings us back to the concept of knowledge exchange, recognizing that this is not a one-size-fits-all process. Knowledge mobilization strategies need to be selected based off of what the research shows, in addition to the ways in which your knowledge users and your audiences access information. If you have research that's relevant for the general public, but you choose to only mobilize and translate it via academic journals, that's not very equitable for the general public, because the general public typically doesn't access information via journal articles. Within the 2003 work of Blythe and colleagues, we see this knowledge exchange model. It becomes very, very, very important, where they posit that over long periods of time, two-way exchange processes that give equal importance to what researchers can learn from decision makers or people, and what decision makers or people can learn from researchers. That's where we start to produce those cultural shifts when you are working together. Cornelia, going right back to your comment. And one way that you can accomplish this is by encouraging some level of exchange and engagement and co-production throughout the process. So when I go through the next slide saying, hey, here's some strategies, remember that all of this should be decided with your knowledge users and your people at the table, and that they should have a voice in this as well. So now we're just going to go through some examples of knowledge mobilization strategies with that caveat in mind, that you're not just selecting these because you think they're interesting. Typically, knowledge mobilization strategies can be divided within 3 different categories. You can make products, so making a thing where you're sharing your knowledge. There's a whole different bunch of them. You could do an event, or you could create a network. And what I'm going to do is just go through some examples of them. When you get the slides, there'll be tons more resources in here as well. So you have everything and just some recommendations. The big one that I want to start with, as I mentioned, they come up all the time, infographics. Everyone loves them. Just short for information graphics. It's just visual and graphical depictions of information. They generally exist on the concept that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Research has shown that infographics, so there is actual research showing that these work. Infographics do have impact. There's no sweeping scoping review that's actually happening right now. Some of my colleagues, McSween and Cadeau and colleagues are actually conducting a scoping review right now to see if infographics have impact. But in some like single studies, they've been shown that they do raise awareness, and they are eye-catching. So they work to grab people's attention. These are some of the ones on the screen that I've created, just so you can kind of see what they look like. They get very popular. People love a good infographic. But when you make an infographic, you've got to make sure that your information can be distilled enough to be made into such a visual format. You've got to keep it clear and simple. They're not the place to display a lot of information at once. You've got to be able to tell a story. So you can see that one in the middle where we've got little arrows going down. All the data connects to tell a story. It can't just be like a random smattering of facts. And you also have to have a place for your knowledge users and your people to contribute and have a voice in here as well. I'm going to show just a couple other infographics so you can get the idea. They can be about anything. This is about the mystery of yawning. We have one here that talks about social media use, and they use different data visualization techniques. Another one here, I like to put this one up because I like cats, the healing power of cat purrs. You don't see a pie chart in sight on that one here on the left side of your screen, but it's still a visual depiction of this research around how the level of a cat purr actually has healing powers to lower blood pressure and heal bones. And then we've got the one on the right side of the screen, which is the 10 places to see in the world before they're gone. Wonderful infographic. I love their use of data visualization. Huge problem with this one is it is a giant scroll of a document. You download it and it's all together and it looks on your screen like it's tiny. You've got to zoom in. What this one probably should have been was a pamphlet. So 10 separate infographics that you could use. You could then promote those on social media. You could put them out there. They could be put up places. Right now, it's not really usable in its format as one full infographic together. It's just way too long. Infographics in general, very popular, demonstrating there's a fairly large appetite in the world for presenting and consuming research knowledge in this kind of visual format. People like research in numbers, but they often have a hard time finding them, interpreting them, and weighing them against all the other information that's out there. If you're interested in learning more about this, one great website to look at is informationisbeautiful.net. Some of you maybe have seen some of their work before. They release these data packs that go viral. If anything of this is interesting to you, I'd recommend looking at Information is Beautiful. And then they also have a section called Beautiful News, just where they release interesting pieces. Some infographic resources. And I will also at the end of these slides give you resources to actually create them, because that's another great question is researchers say, like, I can't make an infographic. That's not my experience. But these are just resources around like the background of what an infographic is and like the key pieces that need to be included in it. I also will offer, I might regret this in September, but if you want training on how to create infographics, let's say you've got the working group decides that's something they want to do and they've got students that'll be creating it. I do run infographic training sessions as well. So I'd be happy to do that. And it's recorded. So now I'm on record saying I'll do it. Another one that comes up a lot is pamphlets. I don't love them. They're a good tool for knowledge mobilization when you actually have a take-home message. I'm sure all of you have gone into some kind of healthcare facility and you've seen pamphlets up on the wall like stop smoking or pregnancy in you. They're less popular because they require people to have a physical copy. But if you have that kind of take-home message and you want people to have that physical copy, pamphlets can be good. Another one that comes up a lot are research summaries, or what are called plain language summaries. And from Goodwee, Tewari, and Panjwani, they define plain language summaries as a synopsis of research findings written in an easily understandable way so that even a lay audience would grasp the concept. I will note that in the next section, we will talk about plain language communication. And as stated by Phipps and colleagues, research summaries come in many formats. They include press releases, policy briefs, clinical practice guidelines, research fact sheets, knowledge briefs, structured abstracts. And basically, they're just documents that summarize research findings and potential implications in clear and concise ways using plain language and clear examples. There's some research that indicates that research summaries may be effective tools for knowledge mobilization work, but this work is limited, and it's important to note that most academics and researchers do not have training in writing for non-academic audiences, so it can be a bit of a challenge. Some resources up there on the screen, that Goodwee, Tewari, and Panjwani one, and the work by Phipps and colleagues. I just want to show you how this can look. This is actually one I just created because now I am working in the agricultural world here at Brock, and it's 11 facts about farming. And these are just the 4 facts, but this is just a plain language summary that summarizes a whole bunch of different research that gives your kind of the key 11 facts about farming in Canada and here in Ontario, Canada. So they can be visual as well, right? And they're just very simple documents. You get everything together. It's easily read. It doesn't have to be written like an essay. It can just be these kind of factual points that gets everything out there. Another one is, I would say it's more of a specific form of plain language summary, which is policy papers. I like to talk about this one because policy is like the creme de la creme of knowledge mobilization work. If you can do policy implications in your knowledge mobilization work, then you're actually really making concerted change. But recognizing to get to policy work, it takes a lot of research and a lot of work. As noted by Scott, and a policy paper is just a research piece focusing on a specific policy issue that provides clear recommendations for policymakers. The general purpose of these is to share knowledge and research on a specific policy issue that's easily accessible and in an understandable format in order to inform a policymaker's decisions around a certain issue. They're written in plain language. They're typically short documents. They might be accompanied by plain language summaries of related research. So there are some great examples of policy papers out there in the world. If you are doing policy work as a group, feel free to email me. I'd be happy to share examples. What I've also done here is for really great resources on the background of policy papers, how to create them. The next one I'd like to talk about really quickly is arts-based knowledge mobilization. Which is secretly my favorite form of knowledge mobilization work. Leaning with this quote, the arts touch people, produce astonishing effects in people in ways other forms do not. And basically arts-based knowledge translation, it's a process that uses diverse art genres, so visual arts, performing arts, creative writing, multimedia, to communicate research, the goal of catalyzing dialogue, awareness, engagement, and advocacy to provide a foundation for social change on important societal issues. And working art into your knowledge mobilization work can remove some of the barriers around literacy and verbal communication and consumption. In 2021, UNESCO outlined a document it was called the Futures of Knowledge Mobilization, Perspectives from the UNESCO Chair. And within that, Perspectives from the UNESCO Chairs, and within that document, there were several different arts-based knowledge translation projects from across the globe that were highlighted, including using artwork to discuss the issue of poverty among homeless and street-involved women. Participatory videos for storytelling and action in Brazil. I like to highlight the one from Brazil, and it was about waste workers, which are typically from the document I read, is one of the most marginalized populations in Brazil. And this group of researchers knew that, and they had research on this, but they wanted to involve those waste workers in the knowledge mobilization work to share their stories. And they actually worked with them to create visual arts, so videos and artworks that actually shared their experiences of how they felt as a waste worker and what their experiences were and what they just wanted. And they shared those with policymakers along with their policy recommendations and policy briefs to really solidify the message. This is what we are seeing. This is how we feel. We as members of your community are feeling this. Here's my story. I removed some literacy issues because they were just able to share and draw and create videos. And they were there right at the forefront being able to share this. There's the hashtag #MeTooIndia campaign. There is the hashtag #MyDignityOfLabor campaign to share individual stories. Spoken word is another example. There has been tons of town halls and community engagement for health in South Africa that have involved art-based knowledge mobilization, people sharing their stories, their narrative experiences of this research project, of this research findings. An example in Canada is one called Shape Your Life Boxing, which provides boxing to people who identify as women that have experienced trauma. And they go through a full trauma-informed boxing program. And they do an art show every year where they people who have participated in the program create artworks of how this program have impacted them. And then they have a full art release where policymakers and funders come to actually see the impact of this project and how it has changed these people's lives. There's a 4-stage process for creating arts-based knowledge translation. And that is all listed online. What I've got next is some of these resources. So we've got the Clover article that talks about some of the successes and challenges. The middle one there is that you imagine the future of knowledge mobilization perspectives from the UNESCO chair. Highly recommend that as a reading material. And then another one, a planning framework for researchers if you want to engage in arts-based knowledge mobilization. And then what I'm going to do next is just show a couple videos of other knowledge mobilization work. So the next one I'm going to show is what are called whiteboard videos. I won't show this whole thing because it's very long.
Hi, I'm Mike Evans, and I'm a doctor, and I've got 3 kids, Willa, Finn, and Angus. And they're like a lot of kids. They like to play sports. They're a bit accident prone. So why am I telling you this? Well, I wanted to talk to you about a thing that tends to happen to kids that do play sports or have the...
So again, I'm not going to show the whole thing, but that's basically what a whiteboard video is. It's that person drawing out your research story. And you might be looking at that being like, we don't have funding to make a whiteboard video. I'm not an artist. I get that. There's actually software you can buy to create whiteboard videos. I have them in the list of resources. The one that I use is called Video Scribe. It's not even that expensive. And they have like pre-drawn images that you can do. You could also hire a graphic designer and budget for that within a granting application, because this might be something you'd want to put out. These are typically very, very, very popular knowledge mobilization strategies. They're great on social media. Again, they communicate across groups. You can also add subtitles in, so you eliminate some accessibility issues. You can translate them. Just one good example. The one that I'm going to show next is one kind of last, like, catalyzing fun knowledge mobilization strategy. It's from a group called the Fun Theory, who believe that behavior change can be achieved if you just make your desired kind of outcome the fun and easy choice. So the Fun Theory, they were sponsored by Volkswagen when it initially started. They basically gave out grants to researchers and research teams. If you had persuasive research that could change the world by just making the outcome goal and the outcome knowledge thought process the fun and easy choice for people. So I'm going to show the video really quickly, recognizing that it's out of context, but it's just a reminder that you can make knowledge mobilization fun. So I know that we're not going to be going around and making piano stairs. You're probably looking at me like, we're looking at small scale fishers. We're not installing piano staircases. I get it. What I like to show that video for is that you can be fun, like knowledge mobilization strategies can be fun. They don't have to always be like, here's my policy paper, my research summary, and my associated infographic. Be collaborative, talk with your people about ways that they want to share their knowledge. And maybe that is fun collaborative pieces out there that you're using visual forms and you're working with the community to get your knowledge out there. Knowledge mobilization doesn't have to be this simple set of static pieces that you do. It can be very, very collaborative. I'd like to talk about social media really quickly as well, as that's a very common but often unthought about knowledge mobilization strategy. Social media can theoretically support co-creation of knowledge mobilization, where you're actually working together with people that are also on this networking piece. There's tons of different social media platforms out there. This isn't my area of expertise. I just kind of know to remind people, like, don't make a social media account unless you really need it. But there is a wonderful colleague of mine, Shauna Riebling, who has created an entire presentation entitled The Effective Use of Social Media for Knowledge Mobilization. If this is an area you're interested in, Shauna is here in Ontario, Canada. I'm sure I could get her to do a session for you all as well. But one just kind of reminder for social media is that you need to consider your team, your primary goals, your audience. Are they actually on this social media? What the current conversation is, select the right tools. Again, I work with a lot of people that work with youth, and they're like, oh, we're gonna make a page on the Facebook. And I'm like, awesome, teens aren't on Facebook anymore. So don't use that social media tool. Are you on, are the people that you're trying to reach even on that? Can they access social media in their country? Think about the content that you have. Do you have enough to actually promote and maintain a social media page? How are you going to measure success? And then also keep in mind your name and design. Those have to be consistent and also add some credibility to your work as well. And then adding one point on that is that just a reminder that social media is not for everything and social media is not for everyone. And it's also really important to consider when you're doing social media work is, do your partners or the people that you're working with already have a social media presence that you could tap into? Do you have to make your own social media page for this work to mobilize your findings? Or does that partner organization that you work with already have a really successful social media page and you could just provide them content and already then tap into the network that they've created? Maybe your work is a social media campaign within an already existing network. The next one I'd like to talk about is podcasts. Very popular. I get at least one student a month coming to me saying, I'm going to start a podcast about knowledge mobilization. And then I say, hold on a second, let's talk about the logistics of this. Podcasts don't have to be a lot of work, but you really do need the correct equipment. You need a script if you're making a podcast. Don't ever go without a script. And a big reminder is that an individual research project should probably never be its own podcast. Maybe it's an episode of a podcast that already exists. Maybe it's a season of a podcast, but probably not a podcast on its own. How much content do you have that you'll be actually able to create a podcast and push out that much information? I always recommend that people look for podcasts on their topic area or for ones that are about disseminating research, which there are tons of them out there. There are tons of podcasts that are just like, hey, here's some interesting knowledge. And tap into those and say, hey, we'd love to do an episode about the work that we're doing, what we're finding, rather than making your own and adding that budget. However, if you want to make a podcast, there is a wonderful guide to academic podcasting, which I have cited here as well. Some resources for doing all this. You probably looked at all the visual stuff being like, I'm not a drawer. What am I supposed to do? There's some great resources online. There's Pictochart, Canva, Infographia, Venngage. Great resources to create visual materials. There's a lot of different other ones. Choose what gives you the most control. There's software to create things. Those infographics I showed you from Brock, I made them on my computer in something called Pages, which is a free program on my Mac. There's dailyinfographic.com to go and look and get some inspiration for infographics. I just want to have a caveat. The ones on Daily Infographic are not always great because anyone can submit, but they have a trending infographic section that's really great. Another reminder is to think about images. When you're putting images within any materials, make sure that you've checked the trademark and the copyright or the required attribution. Two great websites for more freely available images are the Noun Project and unsplash.com. VideoScribe is the software that I mentioned about whiteboard videos. And then often, if you're at an institution, you might have a communication staff person that could help with this as well. I also like to put in here is I should have put this up here is what about students? So do you have students, masters, undergrad, masters, PhD, postdocs? that have some kind of visual expertise. Maybe you hire them as a person to actually create knowledge mobilization materials, right? I often find that among students, they have that creativity a little bit more than I do sometimes. So that's another resource to consider. And then also you're training them around knowledge mobilization if you work that into the project. I'm going to switch gears very quickly. I'm almost done this section to just talk about some academic strategies. So I talked a lot about public facing pieces, but there's also academic knowledge mobilization as well. There's publications.
Jayne,
Remember,
can I just interrupt you for 1 second? I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay.
There's just a couple questions that are specific to some of the strategies you were talking about, so I thought I would just ask them quickly. Anna Carolina asked if you know about any courses that are available, I imagine for free online, about the knowledge mobilization tools that you're presenting?
None that I know of that are free.
Yep. Well, that's something that's a good question for us as a partnership too, Anna Carolina, because that's something we can look into. And I have also noted that Jayne's generous offer for a potential infographic workshop and maybe Shauna with social media. So those are things that I'm noting down for future. And then just a quick question from Erwin. He asked, or they asked, what if the policymakers have a special order to inform the audience? As we know, knowledge mobilization would give the way to tell, you can't tell everyone with every tool. So it is, I guess that's questions about specific strategies for specific audiences.
Yeah, and I think in that case, you would work with that. Let's say you have a policy connection and you would work with them and say, like, how do you want this information? I will say that there are partners that I work with that request, I want this specific report because this is what I need to get funding for my organization. And if we have the capacity, we work that in. And every time I write a knowledge mobilization plan, I will be honest, I write it very loose and big, saying that this is what we're thinking we're going to do. Here are some strategies that we envision might happen, but a lot of this might change based off of knowledge exchange. So I might say I'm going to do some policy papers, so at least the reviewers see that I've thought about this, but I also very much put the caveat in that we might change some of our budget lines because new things might come up or partners might need specific things. I don't know if that answers the question, but I always work specifically with any of my partners or my people to provide the materials that they want. And so if there's suddenly, because you also have to remember that suddenly policy issues will come up. In that world of youth engagement work that I work with a lot, suddenly in Canada, cannabis was legalized, or suddenly vaping became a big thing. So we had to switch gears around what we were focusing on to provide information that our partners really needed at that point to help them. So it has to be very flexible.
That's super helpful. Thank you.
No problem. Okay. Academic strategies, which are just as much fun as, it's not a piano staircase, but I still like them. Publications, keep in mind open access, at least here in Canada, that's required. Conferences or academic knowledge mobilization strategies, training with other researchers, maybe around new tools or new methods or new findings, that's knowledge mobilization. And then there's also graphical abstracts. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with them. At least in my realm, these are becoming very common, and they're basically where journals are requesting the submission of a graphical or visual abstract alongside the body of the article. And it's basically a single, concise, pictorial visual summary of the main findings of the paper. There are typically 4 forms of graphical abstracts. I will show you examples of these next. There's diagram style, visual abstract style, infographic style, and comic style. I will bet that all of you, if you are submitting a paper at any point in your future, you will encounter a graphical abstract. From what I've heard, it's almost every journal is considering making this a requirement going forward. This is diagram style. These are not ones I created. I've got the citations up on the screen. It's just basically produced by the researchers and the research team. The intended audience of these is typically other researchers. It's very technical, contains no background. I mean, all of us are probably looking at this being like, oh, that's fun. I don't understand what that means. But it's very much just for the readers at hand. There's the visual abstract style. This is typically made in PowerPoint by the researcher. The general format consists of a title followed by just the key findings with text and icons and the supporting data. Like if you just had one image to tell your story, that's what you would put here. It's been found that using these types of graphical abstracts on social media actually really increases the engagement with the paper, particularly in the healthcare field. Infographic style, we've talked a lot about infographics, so it just, again, combines text and graphics together in a visually appealing format. These are much more advanced. They're typically professionally produced, and they're meant to engage and relate with a broader audience. Comic style. Comics are becoming really, really popular in knowledge mobilization. They're often called info comics. They're thought to be one of the most visually accessible formats of knowledge mobilization work. They lend to social media posts. A big caveat in this is that not every piece of research can have humor and injected in it to become comical. So these don't work for everything, right? Like here, yes, we can make this little virus and bacteria look funny, but I know a lot of research topics that you couldn't inject humor in it. So it's not for everyone. Some resources for graphical abstracts are all up here. Another thing to remember in all of this is the budget. None of these things produce themselves. Some things to consider with budget is a designer, a social media person. What about printing? Are actually printing these? Image licenses, translation. That's huge. If you are working with populations with different languages, you've got to translate your materials. That costs money. What about knowledge exchange work? Working with your partners, as we mentioned, going back to the community to sharing what you found and then talking together, as Cornelia mentioned, that we're all coming together. That kind of event would cost money. What about that compensation piece as well? Meeting and event costs, dissemination costs, support staff, the co-creation costs. And then within all of this, I like to have a reminder on equity, diversity, and inclusion within all of these materials. This could be a workshop in and of its own, but you need to consider, I call it EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion in all of your knowledge mobilization work. Consider diversity in materials and engagement, that translation piece. And what about accessibility of materials? What about visual accessibility? Have you considered the contrast of your materials? Have you considered what if someone's colorblind? There's actually a website that you can upload your materials to see what it would look like to people with different levels of colorblindness. Have you thought about that? What about physical accessibility to materials? If it's only online, but these people don't have reliable internet, how is that equitable? What about web accessibility? Is it on a website that has any kind of things that it might trigger a seizure? These are things you do really have to consider. And what about your land acknowledgement? At least here in Canada, that is something that needs to be integrated into a lot of our work. Are you going to work any kind of integrated land acknowledgement in there? All of this is another really important reason to co-create with your partners and your people and your knowledge users and everyone that you're working with. They often bring this lens. We might be sitting here and be like, oh, this is a great infographic. And they might look at it and being like, yeah, but you just have an image that's actually really insulting to our population. You may not have thought that. What I have next is 2 slides of EDI resources for you. If you look at only one of these, please look at this first one here, the New Frontiers in Research Fund, the NFRF. They've developed a guide for best practices in equity, diversity, and inclusion in research. It is very specific to this New Frontiers in Research Fund application in Canada, but the practices, I would say, go across different disciplines. And then a couple other ones here. There's some web accessibility ones in there. I'm also happy to send any resource if you're like, oh, hey, I would like to see that color blindness material. Let me know. And then I ended on, actually I looked online before I thought we could just spark the next conversation. I looked online, I was looking at your website in the last couple of weeks around some of your knowledge mobilization strategies. And what I saw, it was publications, working papers, photo of the week, which I loved, the V2V Commons, V2V blog, toolkits. I didn't know if there was anything else, but then I thought we could have a quick discussion, or at least a discussion I'd love for you to have, is what else could you do? And remember, it depends on your people. Who are you trying to reach? What about any media work? Have you thought about, Jessica, I'm not sure if you're familiar with The Conversation, which is a open media source here in Canada that only is based off of research findings. I thought this would be a great partnership to showcase in The Conversation. I know that, what about fact sheets? I saw that there were fun facts in the V2V Commons. Have you thought about fact sheets? Are you doing position papers? I'd also love to encourage the thought around some of that art-based knowledge mobilization around showing experiences of small-scale fishers. With that, I will stop sharing, and I think we probably can do about 10 minutes of questions here.
Awesome, Jayne. Thank you for whizzing through that. There's so much content to cover. I really appreciate it. And your generosity with sharing the resources afterwards is hopefully calming to those of us who are trying to keep up. So thank you for that. And I love the question that you're posing to the group. So for us as a V2V partnership, we're 2-ish years into this 7-year process, and we've got a, fairly ambitious ask, which is we're trying to raise the profile of small-scale fisheries across many audiences, across policymakers, academics, international committees like the FAO and the UN, and the general public as well. Small-scale fishers get either they are relatively unknown to a lot of the general public, or they're misunderstood as resource exploiters rather than resource stewards. So our task is big. So as the Knowledge Mobilization Working Group, what are some strategies that we think might be appropriate for us? What would you like to learn going forward? It's Carolina made a great comment in the chat that this is a real opportunity for us as a partnership to learn together and sort of co-create what this working group would like to tackle. So yeah, open up the floor to questions for Jayne and or ideas for us as a working group. I do see a question from Erwin here in the chat, and I'll just read. Thanks for the answers. Can we get the training, sharing, or something to use knowledge mobilizations for policymakers, governments, and students online in the future? And that might be a good place to just do a small plug for the Knowledge Mobilization Working Group. We are working on a knowledge mobilization guide that would be specific for us. So essentially, it's designed to be a fairly concise overview of strategies that we might want to engage with as we're doing research with our various community partners. So that is something that I am working on, and I will share with you so that we can have input from the partnership before we sort of brand it and then send it out. And it's meant to be a helpful guide. So you're working with communities, or maybe you've got a publication, or you're starting a new branch. Here are some things that we might want to consider.
Yeah, I think the questions around training are very good. Training does exist. It is very expensive to do training. So like the U of T workshop I did is several $1,000s for one person. I do run a 7-week knowledge mobilization workshop for Brock people, and that's free. I'd be happy to do, like, this is kind of, you're getting a condensed 7 weeks right here, which is why your heads are probably exploding. I'd be happy to work in, so specific, I'd be happy to come to the working group conversations as well. And I really like the note that someone put in around linking to capacity building. That's huge. It's also really big in grants. If you're able to link this to capacity building that will train people in knowledge mobilization, that's a huge green flag for reviewers.
Yeah, thanks for that comment, and thanks, Alida, for pointing that out. So there, in the way this 7-year partnership is governed, is there are, I don't know the number exactly, I think 6 working groups, and one of them is capacity building. So Alida is making the comment to capacity building broadly, but also specifically the cross section between the knowledge mobilization working group and the capacity building working group. Yeah, it's great. There's so much that we potentially could tackle as a group. So it's really, it's so awesome to have these early conversations about what would we like to try and tackle, and to see that there's obviously lots of interest in this.
I can go on to the next one if there's no other questions, then we'll save it. And again, this is just beginning of the conversation. You can go afterwards and be like, what was that? But I want to talk to Jayne again. Email me anytime. As I mentioned, I will be available for anyone. Okay.
Yeah, I love that, Jayne. Why don't we do that to keep us on time? And yeah, I really appreciate it. I think it's a perfect sort of start, and I will be keeping track of everything coming up in the comments here and feeding that into our work going forward.
Awesome. I think you can save the full chat from Zoom too, so then you'll have it as a record. I believe you can. So this is a key consideration section, which means I'm going to be switching gears a lot. I apologize ahead of time, but it's just some of those big important things you need to consider. The first big one is plain language communication. A key aspect of most knowledge mobilization work is being able to communicate in accessible terminology, which is often referred to as plain language communication. As outlined by Wickland and Ramos, plain language communication is communication that an audience can understand the first time that they read or hear it. It's clear and concise. It uses short sentences and simple words. It keeps to facts. It's easy to read and understand. Plain language is simple and direct, but not simplistic or patronizing. I've got a video here, the YouTube video. I'm not going to show it today. I never show it because it's a bit long, but it just kind of shows the importance of plain language communication. Plain language communication has become increasingly important in several areas of today's society. For example, in the United States, they implemented the Plain Writing Act of 2010, which requires federal agencies to write clear government communication that the public can understand and use. In the healthcare field, work has demonstrated that communicating effectively and plainly may be critical due to varying and sometimes limited health literacy levels. There's actually been work right now that in the healthcare field globally to require that the need for plain language communication should be a core competency in medical education across the globe to make sure that providers are able to better meet the needs of an increasingly globalized system. And finally, plain language communication, it's just become a cornerstone of all knowledge mobilization work, particularly if you're doing any of those summaries or written pieces, obviously. As noted in their work on plain language summaries, Goodweed, Tawari, and Pinjawani note that often scientific papers are authored in a complex manner using technical terminology, especially jargons, which indeed makes it challenging, in fact, troublesome to understand for those outside of the field. On this account, to make science more visible and accessible, various kinds of summaries, such as plain language summaries, video abstracts, graphical abstracts, and podcasts have come into action. But what is plain language communication? Again, it's just basically a form of communication that lends to audiences understanding what is being conveyed the first time that they encounter material. When you communicate in plain language, you're ensuring that your audience can find out what they need to know, understand what they need to know, and use this information to meet their needs. In general, plain language communication avoids the use of unnecessary jargon. It uses a language level appropriate for a given audience, and it works to stick with the audience. So basically, it lends to audiences remembering what was being said. It's also very key for media engagement. If you're doing any media work, you need to be able to communicate plainly. Another important note here is that plain language communication is not about being patronizing or simplistic. It is about making information more universally understood. I often hear this a lot. I hear people like, oh yeah, we've just got to dumb it down, right? That is very insulting and that is very incorrect. That is not what this is about. It is about making it universally understood so that everyone can understand and share in the knowledge that is being disseminated. Why do you want to engage in plain language communication? It's a staple of knowledge translation work. If you want to move the research that you're associated with into practice beyond academia, it's important to be able to convey those findings to outside audiences. You have to do that through plain language. It helps to increase the accessibility of your work. This is actually probably the biggest point. My alarming statistic of the day is that research has shown that the average American reads at the grade 7 level. And using the Dahl-Chale readability score, a group of researchers found that the average news article in the United States is written at a grade 11 level. So considering that, it means that most people may not understand information that's communicated to them just via the regular media. And that even the most common phrase, oh, just Google it, would likely return results that the average person cannot understand. So we may wonder why people believe misinformation, why we have this challenge. And it may very well be that scientific information is just not accessible, right? It's at a grade 11 level when we need to be at a grade 7 level, right? So it is a big challenge there. So for you as researchers and those of us that work as knowledge mobilizers have to recognize this and work this understanding into all that we do. One last note of relevance here is that there's actually a recent story from CBC, which is the Canadian Broadcast Corporation here in Canada. It's a good illustration of knowledge mobilization or not, in that they found that even fellow experts in a given research field are less likely to cite research studies that are full of jargon. The article is called "Say What? More jargon in a paper means fewer scientists will read it, study finds." And it's just a clear showing of how important plain language communication here. I've got a link to the story here. In general, it allows for the sharing of research and having an impact beyond the scholarly community. If plain language communication was not a practice, then the majority of the world would not be able to know about major research findings because they don't have the ability to just access and understand journal articles full of jargon. And finally, it was put to me that plain language communication helps to produce meaning in a variety of contexts and across sectors. How do you start? Again, it's like, sure, Jane, I know I've got to do this, but how do I actually start to do this? When you're starting to do plain language communication, you've got to sit down and consider 3 things. First and foremost, you need to think about your knowledge users, your people, the people that you are communicating to. What is their language and reading level? What do they care about? What do they need? And you don't waver from this understanding. You need to know how do they talk? What level am I at here? What do they care about? And that's how you base all of your work around. Some strategies for doing plain language communication includes the use of plain language dictionaries, many of which are available online. I have a whole resource slide coming up, I promise. Remembering that introductions are your friend. Make sure you state your purpose and why this information is important for a given audience. Use a structure that makes sense and allows for the logical flow of ideas. A huge one is when you're doing plain language communication, you need to use relevant examples and/or anecdotes. For example, I work a lot with youth, so I provide a lot of examples of how the research that I'm talking about exists in the real world. And I ask questions like, have you ever thought about this, or did you know this? To draw people in and make it very simple and clear right from the beginning. You have to use short sentences and paragraphs. And forgetting something that we were trained in academia, you suddenly have to write in the active voice. Plain language communication is active, not passive. And then you've got to work to cut out all jargon. And next, I'm going to go through some actual resources you can use to do this. One great one is to try to find your sticky side. Now, typically when I do plain language training, which is another thing I'd be happy to come back and do plain language training, is I go through what are called the stickiness success principles from this wonderful book. It's available online. It's quite a fun read. It's called Made to Stick: Why Some Ideas Survive and Others Die. And this book goes through ways that you can actually make your communication sticky and understandable to people. And they call them the stickiness success principles. And they talk about being simplicity. So the idea that if you say 3 things to someone, you don't say anything. Being unexpected. So asking people a question, getting their attention. Being concrete. So once again, being very specific with what you're asking people to do. Being credible. So again, leaning on the fact that this is scientific. These are scientific findings. They are credible findings. And then also being emotional and getting at that through the use of stories. So the understanding that stories are just data with a soul. And one thing I like that I really felt when I looked at the V2V work is you have a lot of stories here. You were talking about a group of people and their experiences. You have those strong stories and those narrative experiences. And I would really challenge the working group to start leaning into that and how you can capture that within your work. Because I do think that could be a really great place to be very concrete and get at the emotional side of people so that they see why this is real and how it exists in our world today. So next, there's a couple other tools. One, there's actually a simple writer tool. This is not some kind of scientific tool that you can plug your text in and it's going to fix your work. So it's plain language. It's more of a fun tool, but it does identify if you've used a word that's not among the 10,000 most common words in the English language. Again, I would note there that there's an equity problem here that it's just in English. But basically what you can do is plug some text in and it pushes back and it highlights any words that are too complicated. I like to give an example of how a colleague of mine used it. So they did this plain summary, they thought was a plain summary of their work, which was, my research attempts to examine the development of children's perspective memory as well as the facts that impact its development. All the words that were read came back as too complicated. And she ended up creating why did children forget to do things in the future, like feed to goldfish or returning their homework? My work looks at how children get better at remembering to do things as they get older and what helps or makes this type of memory worse. So it's just an easy tool that you could use. A more, I would say, professional one is the Hemingway editor. I have it highlighted here. You plug text in, it gives you your readability level. It tells you how many adverbs you used, how many times you've used used passive voice, gives you simple alternatives, and then highlights how many sentences are hard to read or very hard to read. And this is just a free app online. You just go to hemingway.app.com and you can plug your text in right away. Again, equity problem is that it is only in English. Some plain language resources. There's a bunch of different guides. There are the Hemingway editor. There's the Plain Language Action and Information Network, that Simple Writer tool, a bunch of different toolkits. There's a bunch of online plain language dictionaries. I use one that's called wordhippo.com and I love it. I plug in jargon text and it gives me back synonyms that are a lot more accessible. And I know it's a little bit silly, but it works. It's where I go to get my more simplistic terms. Some general recommendations for plain language communication: always think of your audience. Remember that plain language is not based on one single static set of strategies. It's based on how your audience communicates. Remember your goal. Don't say too much, right? It's not a place where you need to get a million things out in one single research study. Research summary. Don't overcomplicate it. Remember, you're not going to be there. You don't suddenly appear in like a poof of smoke when someone picks up your research summary to explain it to them. Follow those stickiness success principles. And remember that text is okay. That's what this is about. Plain language communication is text-based communication. Just make it short and understandable. I always recommend just if you're doing some plain language work, get a colleague from a different area to review it, or a friend. It doesn't have to be even a colleague. I will be honest that my mom reads all of my plain language communication work. And I say, does this make sense to you? Because she provides that outside context of being able to read it and give some feedback. I'm going to quickly go through knowledge mobilization and grant applications. I'm going to posit all of this, that this is very much from the Canadian context. So I was going to go through the, so I'm just going to take a drink as well. So we've got SHRC here in Canada, and they very much see that knowledge mobilization initiatives must address at least one of the following. So
sorry, Jane, poor thing. And I think this could be a fairly light touch section because we are fortunate to have some already funding with the V2V partnership. And a lot of the contexts that we work with are outside of Canada. So
awesome.
Yeah, I'm sorry about your cough.
No, it's okay. It's I know when you get a tickle in your throat.
Yes, and it won't go away.
Like I'm crying. I'm not.
I'm preparing to teach in real life in the classroom for the first time in 2 years, and I expect this sort of thing to happen to me constantly. It's going to be a mess.
Oh. There we go. I always have to sneeze when it happens, and then it's better. So there we go. So what I might actually do is I'll just skim through this really, really quickly because you already have funding. And what I would like to just point out is there we go. Some best practices when you're doing that came out of SHRC for turning research into outcomes and impacts. And so these are like the best practices for doing knowledge mobilization is meetings with knowledge users, building links across multiple levels with partner groups, using or repackaging existing materials or developing new ones in concert with the users and their identified needs. Staff is very, very important. So a project coordinator, knowledge brokers, etc. Remembering to be proactive and multifaceted, more successful and durable relationships, adopting more than one outreach medium, and always developing indicators to gauge your success. I'm going to quickly touch on evaluation next, and then we'll be done. I also wanted to highlight one resource from CIHR, which again is a Canadian funding agency. I know you already have funding, but when you're planning knowledge mobilization strategies, this resource here at the bottom of the slide, the Guide to Knowledge Translation Planning at CIHR Integrated and End of Grant Approaches. Wonderful, wonderful document. Provides a lot of outlines and examples of other resources and projects that people have done. And moving into the last one, the last piece is just evaluation. What is evaluation? It's basically checking if your knowledge mobilization work is doing well. Are your strategies having any intended impact or any impact as well at all? How are your partners, your knowledge users, and your collaborators feeling within this process? This is a really important question. Unfortunately, this is one of the pieces that gets left off most of the time. People don't evaluate their knowledge mobilization. It is critically important that you do so. There's no single way of doing evaluation. The evaluation process you developed will depend on your particular needs, circumstances, and the knowledge mobilization strategies used, as well as the changes that you want to see. But again, basically, this is just making sure that you have metrics in place to check if your knowledge mobilization efforts are doing what you set out to do. Conceptually, evaluation is very similar to testing validity in statistics. So when you're looking at validity, you're checking the degree to which a measure actually measures what it was supposed to measure. When you're doing knowledge mobilization evaluation, you're checking the degree to which your efforts had any intended impact. Evaluation is vitally important. As I mentioned, it is often the first thing to be forgotten. The reason that evaluation is so important that it tells you what to keep doing, what to stop doing, and where you had impact. This information is extremely helpful when you're writing reports and grants and for renewal and for planning. So if you actually are putting policy papers out there, you need to measure the impact of them. If you put an infographic out there, you need to track how many people are downloading it. Where did it go? Things like that. I am also happy to come back and have a whole evaluation discussion with you. I have a whole bunch of lists of indicators that you can use, examples of how to integrate them, some best practices and some do not do that practices. So just a note in that. It's just a reminder that when you were talking about knowledge mobilization strategies, do not forget to talk amongst yourselves around how will you evaluate that? How will you track it? Some just key considerations. I'm not going through all of this. I never do because they will be up on the slides, but it's just remember, you're asking yourself, why are you evaluating? What's the goals? What's the focus? Who's involved? How are you going to do it? And are there any other factors? Some evaluation resources here. Great one should be flashing on the screen is the knowledge translation planning template from Dr. Melanie Barwick at the Hospital for Sick Children. Within that document, there's a whole evaluation section that has those indicators as well. It's also just a great tool to go through to plan some knowledge mobilization work. Couple more evaluation resources. One more, just because there's a lot out there. And this is something I like to hammer home because it is so important, but so forgotten. And then we get to our last slide, the final points for all of this. As a reminder, use the term that you're most comfortable with. Think of your people and how they are integrated. This is knowledge mobilization with people, not on or for people. Engage, engage, engage. This will make the process easier, more authentic, and more fun. Lean into guidance from your audience, from your people. They're collaborators on this. You don't have to decide how to mobilize without talking to them. Remember that academic knowledge mobilization is still knowledge mobilization. Build your own capacity. Something like this is still your capacity building around learning about knowledge mobilization. Within all that, remember, it's going to take a village to do this and also have fun. And then one final resource in this textbook, this is a virtual textbook. It's all online. It's free. There is a chapter that explains knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization as well. It just got released a couple months ago. I believe it's chapter 4 in this textbook is like a breakdown of all you need to know about knowledge mobilization and driving change. And that is it. I've got my contact up there. Again, you're going to get these slides and then a whole bunch of resources that are all in there. And that's it for the formal part.
Thank you so much, Jayne. Huge applause coming at you from many parts of the world virtually. I really appreciate how much content we covered, and that was such a wonderful introduction to what is knowledge mobilization, why is it so relevant for us as the V2V partnership, and planting seeds of where we would like to go with this working group and with all of our work in the partnership over the next 5 years, which is so exciting. So just before I wrap up, are there any questions for Jayne while we've got her here? We might have time for 1 or 2.
And I always know there's never questions at this point because people are digesting. Then what'll happen is when you're actually planning it, you're going to be like, let's email Jayne then. And that's fine. That's how this goes. I'll hear from you in a couple months. And I saw a couple direct messages to me as well in the chat here of people saying, I'd love to hear about the training. I am happy to come back to the working group and do any specific pieces.
Great. Well, we might just segue into that then. I've got some next steps for us. So first on the agenda is we will share Jayne's slides, which are such a wealth of resources for us as a working group. So we really appreciate you sharing those resources with us because, as you said, there's so much to dig into. So next steps immediately is we'll share the slides. So we've got that as a resource. Next, please email me if this is a working group you'd like to become a core team member. For each working group, we have somewhere between 5 and 10 core members. If you're interested, you don't need to be a knowledge mobilization expert. This is a co-creation, co-learning working group. So if it's of interest to you, please get in touch with me. And then third on the next steps for the working group is you can look for a draft of this knowledge mobilization guide for us as a partnership that we're trying to tailor specifically to V2V within the next month or 2. It will be a draft because it's something that I would like to sort of co-create as a partnership. So we're looking for feedback on what is there, ideas of what is missing, to make sure that our guide is really contextualized for us working with small scale fishers in various parts of the world. So those are next steps. Slides from Jayne, email me if you're interested and watch for the draft guide. With that, I would just like to say thank you so much, Jayne. I love learning from you, and thank you so much to our participants for being here. I know the times are challenging sometimes, but we really appreciate you joining us, and can't wait to continue the work of Knowledge Mobilization Working Group and V2V with you. Thanks so much, everyone.
I also got a bunch of bless you direct comments when I sneezed. So thank you, everyone. This is the kindest group ever. You are all lovely.
Thank you so much, Jayne. Thank you, Jessica. Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day. Have a great time of day that you're in right now.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll
Bye,
see you
everyone.
soon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Sammy, bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.